Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客.
This particular episode is also sponsored by the Global Philosophy of Religion Project of the University of Birmingham and the John Templeton Foundation. We're very grateful for their support.
Yes, really grateful to have this grant to fund some episodes just on themes in philosophy of religion. Okay, Richard, it is nice to see you. So you, as I see it, have been on an adventure because you've not only gone all the way from Middle America, so to speak, from Indiana to South Korea and China, but you've gone with the entire clan, with Xie-Ying, your spouse, and 4 kids.
Yes.
Some of whom are, right. The youngest is what, 3 or something?
Youngest is 3, yes.
Oh, I cringe just thinking of it. So yeah, how did it go?
It went, I think, as well as it could, which still meant that it involved a lot of pain and suffering because we flew from Chicago O'Hare to the Incheon airport in South Korea, and that's about a 14-hour flight. Wow. And so 14 hours is a long time to be in an airplane, even for grown people, for
Yes.
adults. But to ask that of children ranging from 11 to 3, it's quite difficult. The only thing that just saved us was that, first of all, Korean Airlines, I have to say, and it's not just because I'm Korean, but it's a great airline. Like the flight attendants are just extremely kind and very attentive. And food was really good. So it was a great experience in many ways, except, it gets tough. The kids have to go to the bathroom, but they're the screens.
The screens in the seat in front of them. Yeah, right. So they can just watch shows or even play little video games or that kind of thing.
We try to keep it like 30-minute intervals or max hour. But for this special occasion, we just removed the restrictions for psychological sanity and the well-being of all. So we let them watch. I think one of my daughters watched the movie Minecraft 4 times. On that flight.
In one sitting?
That's what she said. And I think she might be right because she memorized that movie and she would just cite all the songs and Jack Black's, script. So there was that. So that helped. And otherwise the trip was amazing. I haven't been to Seoul in quite a while, close to 10 years, I think. And we stayed near Yonsei University, which is a great university in Korea. And actually, I didn't know this, but near Yonsei is also the best all-women's university there, Iwayode, Iwa University, and as well as a Jesuit university called Sogang. It's spelled like Sogang, S-O-G-A-N-G. And there I had the benefit of giving a talk there, invited by Hala Kim, who's extremely generous and
known very well.
A really great man. And so that was great. And we went out for some Korean food afterwards. And there's a great philosophy faculty there. So anyways, we had a great experience. We were there for a week, and then we went to the Shandong province, Jinan Airport, to be more specific, and then to my wife's home city, which is Xintai. So it's not Tai'an where you would see Mount Tai as
famous mountain.
Famous mountain,
legendary religious significance. Yeah,
you find it in the Mengzi.
Yeah.
But no, we didn't have it's about an hour and a half or so from there. So, but anyways, we stayed at our home city for about 2 weeks. And met all our relatives, and the grandparents just loved it. I thought that they would get tired, but I think they just relished seeing their 4 grandchildren. So they were really the star, and I just kind of participated here and there. And anyways, it was great. And then we flew back, and everyone was safe. And I lost a backpack along the way at one point. I think I mentioned to you, Justin.
Yeah, right.
I went through the security line. I completely forgot my backpack with the laptop as we were going to China from Korea. And so I didn't have my laptop and my backpack with all my books the whole 2 weeks while in China.
Well, welcome to the club, Richard. I think I've lost track. Either 3 or 4 times I left my laptop in the airport or in the wrong country and had to bend over backwards and go to great lengths to get it back. And it amazes me that I do so because I basically can't live without my laptop, but I guess it just reaffirms my membership in the Absent-Minded Professors Club, to which I now formally induct you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm proud to be a member. And
Yeah.
maybe if a couple of more of these events, I'll become like a gold status or a platinum status member.
Yeah, right.
Because I've never forgotten a backpack like that.
Okay, so the main objective, you have many reasons to take this trip, but one of them was to introduce the grandparents in China to three of their grandkids. They had met your oldest child in person back when you guys lived in Hong Kong, but it's been so difficult during the pandemic, the COVID outbreak, to travel that they haven't had a chance to meet the younger children. The younger children, I assume, mostly speak English. Do they know any Chinese? I'm just curious how much communication there was.
It's difficult. There's not much. We try to teach them some Mandarin, and I tried to teach my older daughters how to read and write in Korean before we left.
Wow.
But it's tough because, it's difficult to learn language. So my hope was that they would enjoy the trip a lot and that they would be more motivated to learn the language. So we'll see if that comes to fruition. But one thing that we realized that was very helpful is the translator devices. So especially with my older daughters, they were hanging out quite well with some of their cousins who actually they spoke English to some extent, but they were using these translation devices where they would speak into the device using either Mandarin or English, and then it would spit back into the language of the user. And so they could communicate that way.
That I didn't know there were devices that could do that already. That's like science fiction to me. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Congratulations on surviving the trip. I have to say, when you told me you were going to take this trip with 4 kids, including very young kids, I heard it with fear and trembling. Yes. I often fly on these long haul flights between continents, and I take a lot of pride in being patient with the young children who are melting down, who are having tantrums and that kind of thing. But I've always thought back when I was thinking about being a parent one day, I never became a parent, but I used to think about it, and I always thought the hardest thing to do as a parent would be to manage a temper tantrum on a plane, because you get all these angry stares and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Some people remarkably can get very angry. And I understand the annoyance and the irritation, but I just wish if they knew that, look, we don't want them to act like that, and there's really nothing we can do. And all we do is we feel very, very bad that we're interrupting other people. But sometimes when they're in a temper tantrum, I mean, it's not because we like it. It's because they don't have fully developed prefrontal cortex or, give your favorite explanation. And so it's not to ruin people's experience. It's just because that's kind of what kids are. And I wish if they would realize, you know what? We were all like that.
Yes,
right. It's not like, I guess they don't think about that. Like at some point you were also throwing a temper tantrum, and you just can't remember it.
That helps. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think it's one of those classic situations where everyone intellectually endorses a certain principle, but they have a hard time abiding by it, emotionally. So the intellectual principle that everyone endorses is that it's really beyond the parents' control whether their kids are melting down or not. There can be moments in hour 12 or 13 of the flight where the kids there's nothing you can do, And yet the anger prevails and they want someone to hold accountable, for the temper tantrum. And so they tend to do it. So the question is, how can you cope with that anger and adopt the more enlightened attitude that it's really not the parents' fault? So one strategy you suggest, which I think is a good one, is that you remember that you yourself were once such a toddler and prone to have temper tantrums in stores or airports or what have you. Mm-hmm. Another one for me that works is just to bear in mind how hard it is to be a parent. I mean, parents are, as I see it, doing this great service for the rest of us, those of us who don't have children, which is they're providing the next generation. My life would be meaningless without a future generation to hand off things, to bequeath knowledge, education, that kind of thing. I just, it'd be depressing for me if this were the last generation. So
that would be very depressing. I mean, all the books we write, all this podcast.
Exactly.
If there's no people,
yes,
that's it.
If no people to inherit this stuff so that it lives on in some way. Yeah. So it's very important to me that we have a next generation. And I find parenting, a few times I've babysat or what have you, I found it really exhausting. So it amazes me that people do this night and day. And if I bear that in mind, it tends to make me more patient. And I even take kind of a certain amount of pride in being the person who is unfazed by the kid in the row behind me or in front of me who's crying the entire trip.
Yeah.
It
That's
helps to
very good, Justin. That you're a good man. And but it is hard. Like hearing the cries, the screaming of a child,
yeah.
it could be very painful.
Yeah. Well, so okay, it's good to check in with you, Richard. It's been a while since we've talked, and I feel like this has been a major event in the history of your family. So I'm glad we marked it in the ritually appropriate way, I guess, in our bumbling way. And speaking of ritually appropriate, today's topic is once again ritual. We've done it before. We've talked about Confucius and the value of ritual. I think it was episode 15. In any case, I'll put it in the show notes. But now we're going to really broaden the discussion and talk about a number of ritually appropriate models that Confucius provides through his example, wearing the appropriate clothes for the right occasion, attending ceremonies that are meant to exorcise or drive out bad spirits, and attending drinking ceremonies. How does he behave in these sorts of situations? So really the topic is sort of Confucius as an exemplar of ritual. And this will all be in connection with one book, or one pian, as they sometimes say in Chinese, in the Analects, which is known for presenting Confucius as an exemplar of ritual, and that's book 10.
Yes, that's right. And today we're really fortunate to have Professor Mark Csikszentmihalyi from the University of California at Berkeley as our guest to help us explore this topic. He's a leading scholar of Chinese thought and religion, and he just published a book on Confucius himself with the University of Chicago Press. And the book's about Confucius, how he's understood in various historical contexts, especially in this case, the Han Dynasty. It's called Confucius, A New Tradition. And one of the first substantive chapters of the book is an historical account, or the legend of Confucius, as what Mark calls a ritual prodigy, which intersects nicely with some of the really interesting passages from book 10 of the Analects that we'll discuss in just a bit.
Ritual prodigy. Yes, that's right. So we're going to talk about Confucius as a very gifted model of good ritual behavior, ritual propriety. And we'll do that right after the musical interlude.
All right, so we are back, and today we are delighted to be joined by Professor Mark Csikszentmihalyi, Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and Eliezer Chair of International Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. Mark is a really impressive and versatile scholar of Chinese philosophy and religion, and has published in many different topics, including material cultures, religious rituals and practices, and more traditional philological and textual issues. We're so glad you can join us, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you, Mark. So I've known Mark for a long time. I have to say, we've actually lived in the same city, San Francisco. I think we must have lived in San Francisco together more than a decade. And I think during that time, you had at least 3, maybe more children under your roof at the time. And we always meant to get together more often, maybe even start a regular reading group or something. And we didn't. And I still regret it. It would have been fun to do that. I just want to mention a couple things about Mark. First of all, I count him as an ally. He's a fellow vegetarian. So whenever we've had some sort of outing, say after a conference or a talk where we have to go to dinner, I've taken comfort in knowing that Mark will also insist on a vegetarian meal, and thus I won't have to spend all my time apologizing to everyone for making them put up with vegetarian dishes. And then I also think of Mark as maybe the one friend I have who has a larger family than Richard's. Is that right?
Yeah, I think by one.
Yep. So I have 4 kids, and Mark, I think you were saying before we started recording that you have 5,
Yes.
which is that's a basketball team, That's what people, I think the 5 children, yeah, you can have your own team there.
Yeah, although I've taken them out, they're really much more a baseball family, strangely. Maybe if we put yours together with mine, we have a baseball team.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, I've known of Mark's works for many years, but I actually first heard of you, Mark, from one of your old students, Youngsun Bak.
Oh, yeah.
And who I actually met up with a couple weeks ago in Seoul. She actually treated us to this really great Chinese Korean restaurant. We had some jjajangmyeon and jampong, which I haven't had for many years. And it was very good. And she was extremely nice to us. And she used to talk about what a wonderful person you were and what a great mentor you were to her. And I think this is something that's pretty well known, Justin, that Mark is is a great
Mark is a
teacher.
generous mentor. I've noticed that. So he has that kind of working group with his graduate students. He's not the distant mentor who just reads, a chapter now and then and pronounces on it. He actually reads text with his students and gives them opportunities to share their work in a kind of working group. He also sometimes leverages his own opportunities to share them with his graduate students. So when Brian and I approached him about contributing to our anthology of later Chinese philosophical texts, he insisted on bringing some graduate students into the project and having them translate works as well. That's just consistent with Mark as I know him.
Very good. Yeah. So today, just to introduce a little bit about the topic, Mark has published on a variety of different historical periods, but today we're going to lean on his vast expertise in the Han Dynasty. So that's the period of China from 206 BCE to 220. And that's the period that you've described with a lot of care and nuance in your most recent book, Mark, Confucius, A New Tradition, which is fresh off the press from the University of Chicago. And that book reconstructs one of the earliest and relatively complete pictures of Confucius as a person from the perspective of the Han Dynasty. And actually, I didn't know about this until I read the first chapter of your book, Mark. But there was, I guess, a excavation in 2015 from a tomb, Hai Hun Ho. And they found this mirror stand, and they found like a picture of him and a lot of different texts. So this is like the earliest biography of Confucius, I guess. Yeah, did you have any quick things to say about that, Mark?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for your generous introductory remarks. Yeah, the book started when I was approached by Paul Cartledge, who's a classicist at Cambridge. And Reaction Books in England, they're publishing the book, and I think Chicago might be distributing it in the US. I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is between the two editions, but Cartledge said, I'm publishing this series called Great Lives in the Ancient World, and I was wondering if you wanted to do Confucius. He said he read my Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Confucius and was interested. And at that point, if you do Chinese philosophy, you automatically say yes, right? Anytime that they admit us into that club of,
That's true.
The great thinkers of the world, or great lives in the ancient world in this case, you kind of have to represent. I'm really glad there's so many histories of art that are really histories of Western art. So it's nice when that happens. But there have been a number of very good books on Confucius's life that have been published in Western languages lately. And so I felt like, what do I do? And I'd been doing some work on the Hai Hun Ho materials. I visited the tomb just before COVID, and it's a really exciting tomb because it's a first century BCE noble in that area, actually someone who had been emperor for a very short time. And so in his tomb, he had a lot of texts, a lot of early Confucian texts, ritual texts, filial piety type texts. But as you mentioned, there's also this mirror stand. And on the mirror stand are images of Confucius and several of the disciples, as well as short biographies of them. And because I work on Han thought and also pre-Han thought, it's a fascinating object because it preserves a kind of Han edition of stories that go back into the 5th century BCE lives of these figures. And so I thought, well, what I could do is write a kind of biography of Confucius that's a little different, that instead of doing my best guess at reconstructing what his actual life was, what I would do is start each chapter with a translation of this newly excavated biography, in each successive stage of his life, and then use that to kind of talk about what that stage of his life has meant over time. Because
Mhm.
I think, the biography of Confucius is kind of important, within the tradition because it's the founder's, biography. But as someone who does history of philosophy, it's also one of the places where, in a way, philosophical argumentation is done because people portray him differently at different times, and it kind of tells you
Mhm.
a lot about the values and concerns of that time that they decide to portray Confucius in that way.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mark. As Mark was saying a little bit ago, a lot of people have written books about Confucius lately. And of course, the presupposition, the sort of premise of these books is that people are interested in knowing the historical Confucius. Confucius, as he, saw himself, as people saw him in his own day and in his own time. Just to make sure that all our listeners are clear about the timeline, Confucius was the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty was a very long one. That's when Confucius lived. Then there was the short-lived Qing dynasty, Qin, Qing. And then there was the Han dynasty, which was, by its end, clearly a very Confucian dynasty, one that celebrated Confucius. And that's the one that Mark works on. Now, of course, everyone always wants to know what Confucius himself was like. But I myself don't suffer from Zhou dynasty monomania. I'm not necessarily obsessed with knowing exactly how these texts that are usually attributed to authors who lived in the Zhou came about, what the actual historical figures were like. For me, so many of the classical Chinese thinkers are characters in this great drama that unfurls over the subsequent centuries. So I'm actually quite interested in how Han Dynasty audiences and readers understood Confucius, independently of whether it's faithful to the historical Confucius or not. And that's basically what you decided to do with this book, as I understand it. Because we have in this tomb mirror stand biography, essentially the earliest biography of Confucius's life. So some people might see that as an opportunity to get closer to the source, to get closer to Confucius's own time and see what people who lived closer to his time thought about him. But no, it's already been several centuries by the time this biography appears. And so what we probably have is a character who is seen as sort of a heroic one and an important founding figure, but seen through the eyes of the Han Dynasty audience that admired him so much.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that, to borrow Russell McCutcheon's distinction between an insider and outsider perspectives, I think that, from an insider perspective, the the key question is, what were the commitments and ideas of the founder, right? But
Mm-hmm.
because I'm an historian, I'm really curious, well, what did a Song reader, think
Mm-hmm.
about this? And that's different, but if you want to understand, for example, the Song dynasty impact of Confucianism, it's much more germane to understand the Song reading than the original reading. In fact, the original
Yeah.
reading is going to confuse you in a way,
Yeah.
because it's at odds with some of the things that the songwriters did. So it's not to say that these outsider concerns or these historicist concerns are more important, but if you're
Yeah.
asking a certain set of questions, they are rather important.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
A real quick question, Mark. So the Hai Hun Ho tome, was that sealed at a certain point, or I mean, because I was wondering the influence that this biography had on subsequent dynasties. Like, were people reading this, or was it sealed off like 2,000 years ago so that we've kind of like we're reading it now, but didn't have much of an impact on the history?
Hmm.
So this biography was, in fact, sealed in the tomb, and this version of it has not been transmitted separately, but it's very close in some ways, especially the biography of Confucius, less so with the disciple biographies, but to information about Confucius that's preserved in the Shiji, the records of the historian,
Hmm.
which probably dates to about 100 BCE, which is probably around when this was being done. And there's so many parallels that one of the things that makes this exciting to me, as someone who spends a lot of time reading in the Han Dynasty is that it tells us a fair amount about kind of the composition of the Shiji and what Sima Qian, the author of the Shiji, the first of the standard histories in China, what kind of Confucius-related materials Sima Qian and his father Sima Tan had. Again, that's a little too much inside baseball, perhaps, but while it was sealed in the tomb, we do have overlapping material that was transmitted in this very influential historical work, and that people read throughout the next 2,000 years.
So we've discussed the book that Richard and I read in preparation for today's episode, and it's sort of organized around the biography. There are individual chapters that essentially elaborate upon each stage of Confucius's life. And the chapter that we focused on in particular is the one that Mark characterizes in his book as one that depicts Confucius as a ritual prodigy. So he's someone who's very gifted, even from an early age, at ritually proper behavior. Now, on its face, it just looks like that just means that he's good at arranging ritual utensils and implements and so on, going through the motions. But Mark says, I think quite convincingly, that it was also implied that he was also showing the right attitudes, reverence and respect and sincerity in engaging these rituals. And that's another way in which he was precocious or gifted. So that's the theme, and we're going to look for opportunities to tie it into some classical sources. So Mark has kindly agreed to indulge us in our usual format, to play along as we engage in our usual format, which is to read selections from influential classical texts and discuss them. And so we were thinking about which classical texts we could use to talk about Confucius as a ritual prodigy. And it occurred to us that actually Book 10 of the Analects may be just the right place to go. So before we read the three passages that we've selected for today, I should say a little bit about Book 10. Normally, when you talk about the Analects and its individual books, for many readers, it doesn't matter all that much whether a passage comes from, Book 1 or Book 6 or what have you. There isn't much to be gained just by knowing which particular book it's embedded in. And that's because, maybe I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but many of the books don't have a clear, coherent, unifying structure or theme. But Book 10 is far and away the biggest exception, at least in my mind. Book 10 seems to depict Confucius as someone who's modeling good ritually proper behavior for others. And so you're supposed to learn how Confucius behaved and how he naturally, sincerely engaged in these ritually proper behaviors, which particular guidelines or rules he was following with respect to what he wore and how he sat down for meals and ate meals with people and so on. And those are all demonstrated or illustrated by Book 10.
Yeah, so we're going to focus on three passages, as we often do. So the first passage, just briefly, is about clothing, and the second one is about a kind of exorcism ritual, and we'll talk about ghosts and spirits. There's some controversies there about whether Confucius believed in them.
Yeah.
And the third is about a barn being on fire and his seeming preference to think more about the humans over the horses. So yeah, those are the three passages, and we're going to sort of tie them together through this idea of ritual prodigy that Mark really interestingly points out in his new book.
Yes. Okay, so I'm taking the lead here. I get to read the first passage. The first passage is conventionally understood as Analects 10:6. So I guess Book 10, Chapter 6 is one way of translating the Chinese terms. And this is the one about how Confucius dressed, the style of the clothing that he wore. And I'm reading from the Robert Eno translation of the Analects, which is freely available online. We'll be sure to link to it in our show notes. Here it is. The junzi, I'm using a Chinese term here that's often translated as gentleman or superior person. The junzi does not hem his upper robes with crimson or maroon. He does not employ red or purple for leisure clothes. In hot weather, he always wears a singlet of fine or coarse hemp as an outer garment. With a black robe, he wears a lambskin jacket. With a plain robe, he wears a fawn skin jacket. With a yellow robe, he wears a fox skin jacket. His leisure jacket is long, but the right sleeve is cut short. He always wears sleepwear that is half again as long as his height. Thick skins, such as a fox and badger, are used at home. Upon putting aside mourning clothes, he places no restrictions on the ornaments he may hang from his sash. Apart from robes for sacrificial ceremony, the layers of his robes are cut to different lengths. He does not wear a lambskin jacket or black cap when making a condolence call. On the first day of the new year, he always goes to court dressed in full court robes. When undergoing purification, he always wears a robe of plain material. In fasting, he always alters his diet and alters from his usual seat when at home. Okay, so that's a long passage full of detail. We just wanted to give listeners a sense of the sorts of specifics that you can find in a ritual-oriented passage like this one. We could start just by asking the sort of obvious question, is this significant? Are these trivial details that shouldn't matter to us now? Or are we meant to see something illustrated or demonstrated in this kind of list of behaviors? And I just want to say that my takeaway from looking very quickly at some of the traditional commentaries, it seems like actually each one of these descriptions of the gentleman's behavior, conventionally understood as the behavior of Confucius, is meant to illustrate something important about Confucius's attitude toward others. So they're often meant to show a kind of respect. So, for example, you can see that there's careful attention paid to how he dresses when mourning or when not mourning. He wants to make sure he's not wearing mourning clothes on the wrong occasion. When you wear the clothes that are appropriate for mourning, it's supposed to be a solemn occasion. Of course, it's disrespectful to the deceased and to presumably their loved ones or their survivors if you don't dress properly for those sorts of occasions. Even the claim about which particular kind of jacket you wear with your robe is meant to be important. So far as I can tell from the commentaries, fawn-skin jacket somehow matches better with the plain robe. A lambskin jacket somehow matches better with the black robe, and so on. So it's really meant to provide people with the sort of detail that help them understand in concrete texture how respectful he is. So maybe we can imagine it's not unlike getting a description of someone who is careful to, dress appropriately for funerals, and then also get a sense of how he or she dresses when they're not at a funeral, when they're just, going to teach a class or going to have a lunch with someone.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you had this experience. I think it's one of the harder things to teach,
Mm-hmm.
to get people to imagine a world where these kind of details don't seem overly busy or overly fastidious in a way,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and I remember one time I was reading the American poet Ezra Pound, who's very interested in Confucianism in a way, but in one of his books, he calls this section verses about the length of one's nightgown and a predilection for ginger. And it's kind of dismissive in a way, right? Because that's just etiquette or just details. But I think
Yeah.
I think what you said, Justin, is absolutely right, that traditionally this has been read as expressing values or inner states in a way that fits in with the broader concerns with Confucian moral self-cultivation that that link it up with the picture of ethical development that we
Yeah.
know in other Confucian texts. So Jushi, when he's talking about these passages in particular, says, that this is not something Confucius did himself. These are minor points of ritual preserved in the Kung Clan records. So, by the song, they're already kind of
Mm-hmm.
saying this is somewhat minor, but if you look at early texts like the Bai Hu Tong, which is a first century CE text, it says each of these points has significance. So, when he talks about not eating meat or not picking up musical instruments, that's the way that the ruler observes the death of some of their
Mm-hmm.
subordinates. You know, this is a performance that signifies the loss of a particular relationship to the ruler. So the ruler doesn't wear this certain type of jacket or cap when making a condolence call. He'll avoid doing the things that are reserved for the family of the deceased, right? To show that he understands the proper kind of relationship. Um,
Mm-hmm.
And it actually says that he doesn't wear lucky clothes near others' misfortune, that some of these clothes are more celebratory, and so the gentleman makes sure not to wear those, right? So in these what seem like very detailed, almost pedantic rules within the symbol system of the time have meaning. And so it
Yeah.
concludes that, you don't wear lucky clothes because this shows that he supports their grief, right?
Yeah,
And so
right.
the deeper lesson or insight here might be that these seemingly small details are actually much more significant, and they can sort of pile up, and it can kind of set the mood. It can also signal the sort of attitude you have. And so if people were to just dismiss all these little things as, oh, just trivial and totally unimportant, it would be worth thinking about whether actually they do have more significance than you might give it. And I guess you can come up with examples, right, that will move students even today in 2026, like wearing hot pink, shorts or something to your grandma's funeral. That's not going to work, right? And so certain colors do seem to correspond to the proper mood or the event. And so, I think you can come up with all sorts of examples. I think just in some episodes ago, you mentioned something like a Metallica T-shirt, right? You shouldn't wear that, perhaps,
right.
to a funeral either. And actually, and I think students know that, and they wouldn't do that either. And they do think there's an appropriate way of behaving and subtle cues that you should register. Just one quick little note, because there's this little passage that I would teach in my Intro to Philosophy class in the Analects. Maybe it is book 10. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it's book 10, but it says something like Confucius would not sit on the mat until it was straight. And that's all it says in that passage. And several of my students, I asked them, isn't this way too fastidious and way too detail oriented? And they were really defending Confucius. They were like, well, no, if it's not straight, it's all wrinkled up. It's going to weigh on you and it's going to irritate you.
Yeah, that's also book 10, that you wouldn't sit unless the mat was straight. And I can't remember exactly what number it is, but it's close. In my mind, it's close to this one. It's
10-9, I think.
10-9. Okay, yeah, just a little bit after this one. So I'll say this about the sartorial details, the details about what particular clothing he wears for what particular occasion. As Mark notes, Zhu Xi, who comes along much later, he's a Southern Song Dynasty Confucian philosopher, passed away in 1200 CE. He's already aware of the fact that many of these finer points about what you wear, what you don't wear, are no longer observed. And so perhaps it's just obvious to him that they're kind of trivial, and that's why he is so dismissive. But Mark's point is that back in the Han, they still meant a lot to the audience at the time. And so similarly, I think all of us can imagine going to a funeral wearing a hard rock or heavy metal T-shirt, or I just imagine someone going to a funeral wearing dumpy clothes, like maybe a coffee-stained shirt that they just happened to take out of their drawer right before they left. That seems disrespectful. It seems, in some sense, lacking in compassion for the survivors of the deceased. This gives us a chance to talk about a couple of things that I think will be obvious to some of our listeners who are more familiar with the history of Confucian philosophy, and perhaps not so obvious to others. One has to do with this word li that we're translating as ritual, which is a very capacious term in classical Chinese thought. So it's used very broadly, not just to refer to ceremonies. That's how we tend to think of rituals nowadays, but to all the social protocols, even the very pedestrian ones, ordinary ones, that are meant to play some sort of role in creating social order and social harmony. I like to think of it as referring to the particular subset of social protocols where some sort of expression of respect is expected. And so even situations that seem like they're relatively informal and not particularly ceremonial, like bowing, or in modern day shaking hands or holding doors open for people and that kind of stuff, those two count as rituals or li in the relevant sense. And so you might wonder, what are all these prescriptions having to do with clothing doing in book 10, which is supposed to be about li? And the answer is, well, these two are opportunities to express or fail to adequately express your respect for others. So these two are also ritually prescribed. That's one point I wanted to make. I also wanted to say a little bit about the perceived strictness of Kongzi or Confucius's rules of proper or appropriate clothing. So there is another passage, a much discussed passage in the Analects 9:3, where Confucius concedes that there's been a change in the cap that people wear for a particular ceremony. They used to wear, linen caps, but those are rather expensive. People can't afford them anymore, so now they wear silk caps. Silk caps in his day apparently were cheaper. And he says that's more frugal and that's fine. So he endorses this change. So at least according to that particular passage, Confucius seems to allow that it's not inscribed, as it were, in some kind of mandate that comes from on high, that you have to wear exactly these clothes for exactly these occasions, not taking into account contingencies of circumstance whatsoever. Of course, you're allowed to take into account various things like whether you can afford the relevant ritual implements or clothing. And I notice that throughout the Confucian tradition, there are often allowances for the fact that maybe a ritual just doesn't have any kind of social purchase anymore, that people just don't buy into it. I know Zhu Xi says that some rituals should probably go just because people treat them as laughable. They don't take them very seriously anymore, and thus it's better not to perform them than to perform them at great expense to the reverence that people should have for ritual tradition. So, yeah, I guess I just want to say there's a kind of question mark here about how strictly he adheres to these particular rules of appropriate clothing.
You bring up the kind of trade-off perhaps between kind of economic costs and kind of ritual. And I think that's a real key one for understanding a lot of passages in the Analects. Like Confucius is only willing to accept gifts of, ritual offerings rather than, right. And there is this type of ritual economy where if you become a member of Confucius's circle, you are kind of renouncing the ordinary economy and you're buying into a different set of values that are based on a ritual function that material objects have. And I think that in a way, just adhering to the ritual codes or the guidelines that are being described in such detail in Book 10 is kind of a sign that you're committing to this alternate kind of schedule of values. And so that to me is one of those hidden themes that comes up again and again in the Analects.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So there's the market value of things, and then there's the ritual value of things. So a good illustration of that might be Analects 7:7, where this is a passage that people often invoke as evidence of Confucius's indifference to class in recruiting students. So Analects 7:7 says something like, I will teach anyone, I've never denied instruction to anyone, so long as they've been able to offer up at least some sort of symbolic gift, like a little bit of silk or a bit of dried meat or something. There it seems like he's saying, what I care about is whether my students are willing to show, respect and appreciation by whatever means they have available to them. Some of them may not be able to afford to give me full tuition or a proper gift, but so long as they show that respect in the proper way, the object, even if it's not worth much on the open market, so to speak, will still have a great deal of ritual value.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one question I had was, is it possible that ritual itself can already be built out of considerations that is partly due to extrinsic or economic reasons? Because a lot of people, when they think of ritual, they'll also think like these practices evolved out of certain kinds of desires and necessities, or is ritual always more about like a kind of a appropriate form or more of a moral kind of consideration? Because, like, for example, even this passage that we just read, it says like in hot weather, he always wears a singlet of fine or coarse hemp as an outer garment. And I wondered if some of these protocols are more about just practical considerations rather than necessarily tied to like a respectful gesture. Because, they don't always seem to be about that, although a lot of them are. So I was wondering if, how do rituals get built up? Because the story I would have told is part of it has to do with, like human psychology. We need to express some respect or things don't go well. Part of it has to do with human necessities and desires and just a scarcity of goods, and perhaps. So, yeah, don't they all kind of sort of come together to kind of help develop these particular rituals?
Yeah. I mean, speculatively, Mark can correct me if I'm wrong, even those lines that seem to be making some concession to practicalities, like warm weather, you've got to wear lighter clothing, arguably those are still meant to show how one still dresses respectfully in spite of this particular circumstance. So obviously, if it's very hot weather, it might be tempting to wear very little, but that would be scandalous and not very respectful to other people. So it's showing what sorts of concessions he's willing to make that are still within the bounds of propriety. So there's that passage in the Analects, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, where Confucius is too sick to stand. So he's lying in his sick bed, but his lord is coming to visit him. And so he instructs his students to throw the ceremonially appropriate clothing on top of the bed sheets, on top of him. He can't actually get up to change into the clothing, but still he wants to make a gesture at wearing the appropriate clothing. So they lay the court attire, his court appropriate clothing on top of him, so that he's at least kind of showing his commitment to dressing appropriately when he receives his lord.
Right. But I guess there I would have thought the reason why the protocol isn't for you to then, but still force yourself to get up in a feverish state and still like try to, because your health, it needs to be part of the consideration. And so the protocol already has weighed in. Yeah, that also, of course, matters. But of course, yeah, you're right. It still needs to conform to the proper propriety or the form, the right form. But to some extent, I would have thought, yeah, no, there's already built into it some of those, maybe, I don't know. I mean, do we want to say external considerations or? Yeah. So I don't know. I was just wondering if that is already kind of factored in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Justin raised a couple of examples where there is some factoring in, like where rituals can be declared obsolete for certain reasons. But it is notable that there's no point at which Confucius was talking about toasting someone at a village banquet and says, plus wine is great, or, they're really, to a certain extent, the origins of the rituals because a lot of these rituals are kind of based on sumptuary rules. That is, your social rank determines how many ding vessels you're allowed to have. And that reflects not economic status as much as kind of a social rank. He's very concerned that you follow those rules and they don't usurp the ritual of a higher social position than the one you occupy.
Yeah.
But it has to do with this, this set of attitudes and buying into this ritual system more than it does the specific costs. Like we, as from a consequentialist kind of point of view, would want to take into account.
Okay, that's interesting. So if I understand you correctly, Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. The idea is this: you're tempted to assess each ritual on a case-by-case basis and say, do the, psychological, social benefits of this particular ritual outweigh the cost? But actually, sometimes Confucius is just showing his respect for rituals, the traditional rituals, period, not any one taken in a case-by-case manner. Why? Well, because being completely heedless of ritual tradition and just sort of improvising and making things up as you go along and so on is flippant, right? It's disrespectful itself. So if you reserve the right to improvise whenever you feel like it, that's just more or less saying, I don't respect other people. I don't have this faith or confidence in a tradition, which is where we have these shared social values and these shared ways of showing respect and reverence toward one another. Is that right?
That's really well put, yeah.
And the justification, so it's not like something like, well, there's probably good reason to keep adhering to the tradition. It probably served a specific purpose or point. Because that's kind of what happens in the sheep and the ceremony passage, right? With zigong. Because zigong is like, the sheep is so expensive. Why don't we just get rid of this ceremony? And then, right, Confucius famously says something like, look, you care about the sheep and maybe saving some money. I care about the ritual, right? And we discussed this passage a while back, I think, maybe even last year. I always loved that passage. And so, Confucius seems to be taking kind of a non-utilitarian kind of stance. And I guess for some people, they might just think, oh, well, maybe he thinks, look, you don't always know. There's that old kind of Chestertonian fence idea where you come across a fence and the question is, should you just get rid of the fence? Because you can't see any reason or purpose why it's there. Now, the line from some people would go something like, there was probably a reason that the fence was built. So maybe you should get rid of it, but you shouldn't assume that it's doing no work. So that's a kind of thought.
Yeah.
But it could be always, more ritual form considerations rather than these kinds of material benefit considerations for sure.
Yeah.
But just to recap, so both you, Justin, and Mark, do think that the rituals are much more solidly grounded in moral considerations having to do with expression of respect and reverence, and also considerations of the cultivation of virtue and good moral character. So that's sort of like the more of the ultimate sort of foundation for the rituals, at least for Confucius.
Yeah, maybe I'm too influenced by my later Confucian philosophers that I read a lot of, the Neo-Confucians, the ones who come along in the Song Dynasty and thereafter. But by then, the consensus is relatively clear that the justification for the rituals is the social psychological effects that it has on the character of the practitioners. That's the primary justification. That's not to say that these later Confucians, like the Chung brothers, Hu Hong, Zhu Xi, it's not to say that they deny the existence of ghosts and spirits, but they just don't think that you're embodying the right attitude as a ritual practitioner. If you're hoping to engage in a little quid pro quo, like hoping to get something out of the order of ghosts and spirits by performing a ritual, that's not where the value of performing rituals lies. But admittedly, that's a later interpretation, and I'm mindful of the fact that they had their own agenda and that it may not be faithful to the historical Confucius, or for that matter, the Han Dynasty Confucius that Mark is tracking.
Yeah, I'd say that's the case, although the body of sayings associated with Confucius that are circulating in the pre-Han and Qin-Han periods are really, I think, one thing you can say about most of them is they're rejecting what anthropologists will call the do ut des kind of, I give so that I will receive something, the transactional account of why one does rituals in favor of a set of more psychologistic explanations of the effect of ritual participation on one's own psychology in a way, right? So I do think that while Justin's right that Sung and later Confucian's readings of these texts will almost preferentially interpret them in terms of these, dispositions of reverence or sincerity, whereas earlier readings will pay much more attention to the explicit function of the ritual. It is the case that I think from the earliest Confucian writings, there is this shift towards this other set, and it only becomes more pronounced in the late imperial period, as Justin said. So I think, Richard, that your basic insight there is absolutely valid, that there is something key about this alternative kind of explanation of the function of ritual, even from the earliest disciple conversations that we see in some of the excavated texts.
Yeah, some of these issues come up in like Leviticus, right? For example, like why do they wash their hands in a certain sequence, or why do they not eat certain kinds of meats? And one explanation that sometimes you find is that, well, at that time, it was good because it was it was unsanitary and you would get sick. And so people would sometimes give these kinds of explanations to justify or why it was right for them to engage in these practices that seem kind of strange from, a modern perspective.
Yeah. Just to fill in some of our listeners, since we have a lot of people listening to us from the Chinese-speaking world, Leviticus is one of the important books in the Old Testament, so essentially the Judeo-Christian Bible. So I think we've set ourselves up perfectly for the next passage, because the next passage is about an exorcism ritual. That is a ritual that has to do with getting rid of bad ghosts or spirits, and it describes Confucius, how he behaves in that context at the exorcism ritual. And I guess we had planned to have Mark read that one.
Yeah, so these are a couple of short rules that gentleman observes. again, in Robert Eno's translation, when villagers gathered to drink wine, he left as soon as those bearing walking staffs departed. When villagers mounted the annual exorcism procession, the Noa sacrifice, the master stood in court robes at the eastern steps of his residence.
Yeah. So the master's illustrating or demonstrating two ritually appropriate behaviors here. One has to do with after a gathering to drink wine, when does he leave the hall where they've been drinking? It says he leaves as soon as those bearing walking staffs departed. And then the commentaries are quick to explain those bearing walking staffs are people of a certain age, elders. So he's sure to leave after them. He's not so presumptuous as to leave before the elders do. But then sometimes the commentaries add, but not too long after them. He's still kind of trailing them, maybe so as to show his respect and serve them. The second of these two passages that Mark read, when villagers mounted the annual exorcism procession, the master stood in court robes at the eastern steps of his residence. This is really interesting. So first of all, what do we mean by exorcism procession? You say the word exorcism in English to a 21st century audience, and they imagine a priest bringing a cross over a child and trying to exorcise a demon from the child. It's not that at all. I imagine the details are a little bit obscure and controversial, but I noticed one account, I think it's Konganguo, one of the earliest commentators, suggests that this is the sort of ritual where you're going through the rooms of a building after disease has come through, and presumably bad spirits accompany the disease. And so they're trying to drive those spirits out. So that's one issue is, what exactly is this Noa exorcism? The other question is, why does the master, presumably Confucius, stand in court robes at the eastern steps of his residence? And this is where we touch upon the controversy that we were just talking about with respect to the first passage. How much does Confucius seem to care about rituals as some way of interacting with the world of spirits and ghosts? Because at least on some commentaries, Mark can remind me which ones, it seems like he's standing on the steps in his court robes because having all these kind of unruly ghosts and spirits that are associated with disease, having been driven out, he wants to be this kind of stable presence to reassure and protect the spirits of his own ancestors. Is that right? So that they don't flee. I'm not sure if I have the details correct, but the point is, if that's the correct explanation for Confucius's behavior in this case, that suggests that A, he really believes that there are these nasty, unruly spirits that are being driven out. And moreover, he believes that there are these ancestral spirits that might be scared away, and that his behavior is justified in part by the way that it affects these spirits.
Yeah. I think this is a great passage that illustrates the changing attitudes towards the specifics of this ritual. Because you mentioned Konganguo in the Li Ji, in the classic of rites, you have this passage, but then at the end you have a short clause that's added that says he did so to protect the spirits of the residents. So the idea is that he's bolstering the kitchen god, the local spirits that will help protect the residents from these outside spirits that are coming. And so early on, he's read as actually doing this kind of spirit work directed at the high ancestor. Whereas if you start to look at later commentaries, by the time you get to the 6th century commentator Huang Kan, he writes that Confucius was serving the high ancestor out of the filial piety in his mind, that in a way this is illustrating that value. And then by the time you get to Jushi in the Sung dynasty in the 12th century, he paraphrases Konganguo's comment, but he says, well, some people say this, but he says that actually Confucius wore the robes to demonstrate his own Chung sincerity and Jing reverence. And so, and he actually contrasts the Nuo, this ritual, he talks about it as it's kind of like a play that people do annually, that people perform this. So the villagers are doing that, and Confucius stands to demonstrate his Jing, which is more serious.
Yeah, it's very pronounced. For what it's worth, my general impression is that certainly beginning with the Chung brothers in the Northern Song and thereafter, the standard view among Neo-Confucians is that, in fact, there may be a sense in which residual parts of your ancestors stick around after their death, and they're there to appreciate the sacrifices that you make for them and so on. But as for the details of how that works and which parts of them, if you want to talk about Hun and Po souls, or there are lots of different theories, right? Which parts of them linger and whether they actually consume the food and that kind of thing, people can come to their own conclusions. And that's all not important, actually. We Confucians, they would say, what's important for us is that the rituals in some ways cultivate and instantiate the right attitudes, the right psychological states, feelings of respect and reverence. And you really see that in Juxi's commentary on this passage. Yeah, he's really trying to downplay the idea that it matters at all how the exercised spirits, the bad ones, or the good spirits, are responding to Confucius's behavior. It's more about just showing your respect and so on. The context I feel like we should add is this much discussed passage, Analects 11:12, where Lu, I think it is, asks about essentially the afterlife. And Confucius says, well, you don't understand life, so why are you asking about what happens after death? A lot of people have looked at that passage and said, so Confucius doesn't seem to think it's particularly important what happens after you die. It's a this-worldly philosophy. It's a this-worldly religion. It's a religion where you don't need any particular account of what happens after death, or perhaps even any particular metaphysics, in order to adequately ground or justify a claim about how you ought to live. And that's one very visible way of reading the Confucian tradition. But maybe it's a little bit too shaped or influenced by my Neo-Confucians, and perhaps also by 20th and 21st century scholars working on Confucianism who like to downplay the more superstitious or spooky parts of the Confucian tradition.
So these are different interpretations. And what's interesting is it seems like the interpretation shifts depending on one's own worldview. And I think that's really important to remember, because it seems like these are interpretations of what Confucius was trying to do, right? And I guess we can never know for sure what went on in his mind, let's say, in engaging in these practices. But it's interesting that the interpretations seem to hinge on whether you find it more plausible that there really are such spirits or not. It's strange that that should influence your interpretation of what was going on with Confucius's actions. So it seems like a kind of a cautionary note to me that we shouldn't kind of read into text. I mean, you could defend it, and you may even be right, but you got to be careful about whether your own metaphysical views are influencing your readings or interpretations.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a human being, so of course I read a lot about this Confucius guy, and I'm naturally very curious about him and like to think about what he was really like, but I recognize that we have very limited, very, very indirect access to him. And so for the most part, when I'm adopting a more enlightened stance on the issue, I try to just think of him as an important force in Chinese intellectual and religious history. And I'm thus more interested in the different historical iterations of Confucius than the so-called actual Confucius or Zhou Dynasty Confucius. And for me, then, it's quite interesting that in the Han Dynasty, there were Confucians who were quite comfortable seeing Confucius as someone who knew how to interact with the spirit world. Kong Anguo is the commentator who is most explicit about suggesting that Confucius is mindful of the spirits and trying to elicit the right response from the spirits. Kong Anguo, he's a Han Dynasty commentator. So it's revealing to me that he himself doesn't hesitate to attribute this role to Confucius, where he's, in some sense, interacting with spirits.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things that comes out of the fact that you just mentioned that there are, hundreds of years elapse between Confucius's death and our first biographical account of what his life was. The idea I play with in the book, because I set out to write a biography when I don't feel that we have enough data to actually write a true biography. By then, hundreds of years after his death, there are already different representations of Confucius. And so,
Mm-hmm.
in some sense, his life story becomes a way to fit these potentially contradictory versions of Confucius into a single biography. So he starts out as a teacher, but then he's frustrated at that, at his inability to influence things. And then
Mm-hmm.
he starts to edit the Spring and Autumn Annals and the other classics for posterity to influence posterity. And so, in some sense, you could see that, that it's possibly an accurate reflection of his life, but it's also possibly a way to take two different constructions of Confucius and make them both valid by
Mm-hmm.
saying these are different stages of his life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel that to some extent, our understanding of Confucianism, the places where there are potential contradictions, biography becomes a way of reconciling them.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit about the question of whether Confucius is a ritual prodigy, and so he's born with certain extraordinary qualities or extraordinary marks, or whether there were eclipses at his birth. All these things that are associated with kind of
Yeah.
theories of divine kingship, which is part of this idea we have about what early Confucianism believes. But then at the same time, his life story has a different kind of understanding that there's contingency in the world and that he's frustrated. And so he's the uncrowned king. And that really his insight lies in his ability to understand contingency. And so you get these two very different models of whether of someone born with extraordinary qualities is destined to become a ruler like King One,
Mm-hmm.
or, can people be tragic figures? And the
Mm-hmm.
biography, in a way, is an occasion to have both side by side. So I think what Justin's talking about in terms of there being this long period of time we don't have information about his life, I feel like part of the reason that all of a sudden people are interested in telling his life story is to find some way to reconcile these somewhat different positions that are all being associated with Confucius and his followers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I just wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to read a little bit from the biography, if that's okay with you, Mark. This is your translation of the biography, the part that begins with his youth. And it's interesting to people who want to resist the more religious, so-called religious reading of Confucius and the Confucian tradition that he spawned, because it sure seems like they're saying there are all these great auspicious omens surrounding Confucius's birth. So here's the biography. This is again from that tomb that Mark and Richard were talking about earlier. In the 22nd year of the Lord Shang of Lu, which is to say 551 BCE, Confucius was born. Because he was born with a depression on the top of his head, he was called by the personal name of Qiu. This is the Chinese character that means hill. So, in other words, they gave him a personal name in light of the fact that he seemed to have this little divot or depression on top of his head, which made it look like there was a hill on his head. So that's an auspicious sign. That's a sign of his potential greatness. His courtesy name was second son Ni, and he carried the Kong master's clan name. Then it goes on to say, playing as a child, Confucius took delight in setting out the sacrificial ritual vessels in a ritually correct fashion. Everyone thought him extraordinary. When Kongzi was 17, the various lords praised his worthiness. So this Han Dynasty biography is not afraid of invoking supernatural explanations for Kongzi's greatness.
There's this question I want to ask you, Mark, about this notion of ritual prodigy, because one of the things you also talk about in that chapter in your new book is the way that rituals are also connected to a process of habit formation and moral formation. And so on the one hand, you have Confucius, who's a ritual prodigy. He seems to have a kind of this incredibly innate moral perceptiveness or ritual perceptiveness. On the other hand, ritual is the practice that you need to undergo in order to train yourself and then gradually develop to become a good human being. So it seems like there's a kind of an odd tension there because ritual is, on the one hand, this kind of a social moral technology to cultivate yourself. And then on the other hand, Confucius had it without going through the process of ritual, which seems to almost undercut what was originally considered the value of ritual. So, yeah, is there a tension there? I mean, maybe there's no like contradiction, but it's interesting that Confucius was born with this innate sense of ritual propriety, but a big part of the ritual, or why its importance in human society, is that it cultivates the right mindset. And I wonder if Xunzi would have been worried about this way of thinking of Confucius as ritual prodigy.
That's a really interesting question, Richard. I love it. Can I make sure I understand it correctly? So the question is, on the one hand, it seems like ritual is, as you said, kind of social technology. So it's something invented, something you have to learn. It would be weird if someone just innately understood how to perform rituals. But on the other hand, Confucius is depicted as a ritual prodigy, someone who from a very young age is able to engage in ritually proper behaviors, laying out the vessels in the correct order and so on. And that suggests that, in fact, it is more natural and not so much an invented thing that you have to be taught. Is that the question? Or
yeah, that's the question. I mean, I guess the way you can explain it is, well, Confucius had certain natural abilities and a perceptiveness and an intuition and intelligence, that those are the qualities that help you to become a good ritual master. And he had it in abundance, these various ritual characteristics, or characteristics that are like directed toward good ritual. And so he was born with that. And then he was naturally endowed with those features. And then like he quickly picked up, like musical prodigies, right? I mean, music is in many ways like violin was invented, but you have prodigies who pick up on it real quick because they have other powers that are much more innate, or they have a real gift, as we call it, but they still have to learn it, but they learn real fast, and so is that the right kind of analogy? I don't know. I'm still thinking through this question myself.
In English, we say a quick study, right? So, two kids can both learn to play piano or violin. Presumably, they have to learn it. There's no such thing as just sitting down with a violin or a piano and suddenly playing like a virtuoso. Yeah. So they still have to learn, but some of them learn much more quickly, much more easily than others. Yeah. For some, it's like a hard slog, and others, they take it up quickly. So I suppose that's a nice solution, actually. Yeah.
Two things. One, with Xunzi, you asked that question. I think if we look at his Fei Xiang, his Against Physiognomy chapter, it's really clear he doesn't like the idea that, I think your intuition's absolutely right on that, on Xunzi's attitude.
Yeah.
I think that this kind of fits in with the emphasis in this particular biography on writing the Spring and Autumn Annals, because to a certain extent, instead of being born with either great strength or a capacity to lead other people or something like that, he's showing at an early age that he's got this knowledge of the past and connection to the kind of Joe ritual system. In a way, the writing of the Spring and Autumn Annals is the kind of ability to tease out the patterns of success and failure, and who in the past was moral and who in the past was a bad example. And I think that as a bookend in the biography that begins on this intuitive understanding or mastery of ritual, and then ends with him writing the Spring and Autumn Annals, I think there's a kind of bookend nature to those two things. They're both this kind of ability, and it's the same kind of thing when people find this natural objects and come to him and he can identify it and say, this is X or this is Y. He just has the sage for understanding the past in some ways. It's also kind of, I feel that the idea that he's got these intrinsic things, you don't want to believe anyone is kind of born on second base in terms of their knowledge of ritual. If you believe that everyone has the same, if you want a kind of egalitarian idea that everyone has the same access to ritual and therefore ritual self-cultivation, right? And I think at the basis of your question is that. And I think this is another place where we're kind of seeing multiple points of view on, are certain people marked out by history as sages, or does everyone have the same capacity? And I think that if we really look carefully at the early writers, we'll see that on this particular issue, there are different points of view.
So I think Lena, our engineer, will giggle at what I'm about to say. But okay, so once again, Aristotle thought that, you can have mathematical geniuses or prodigies, but when it came to something like practical wisdom or like really good moral kind of sensibility, you can't get that without human experience and time and engaging in all kinds of social behaviors within a context of a society and community and sort of picking up on cues. It just takes a longer time than children who are very mathematically gifted. So, yeah. So I wondered how the story would go with more of the kind of ritual prodigy. Like, what are the gifts that were so natural and innate, where even at a very young age, you're just like, you just see what should be done, what should be worn, how to behave, what to say.
Okay, so now we have truly guaranteed that this will be a complete and proper episode because Richard has mentioned Aristotle, as he never fails to do. But yeah, I think that analogy to mathematical gifts or being a mathematical prodigy is useful. There's another passage in the Mengzi which suggests that one of the sage kings, I think it was Shun, wasn't out in nature already a sage, but he was such a quick study that he rapidly became a sage. He only needed to encounter some useful lesson once before he would quickly internalize it, unlike ordinary people who have to encounter it again and again. So yeah, I think that's one nice solution. And I guess, there are passages both in the Li Ji, which we're translating as the rites, I guess, or the record of ritual, and in the Analects itself that suggests that there's some people who are just born with understanding. Sheng Er Zhi Zhi is the classical Chinese phrase. People who are born knowing it, born understanding it. And in some ways, those are the people who are most accomplished. Those are the people who have the greatest potential. Even in these old texts, including the Analects itself, it seems like it's positing that there are people who are born with this deep sort of insight. Yeah, so we've talked quite a lot about this, so we should probably make sure we make enough time for the third passage on our list, and that falls to Richard. Yeah.
Yep. So this one is from 1012, and we'll call it The Barn's on Fire. So it's a fairly well-known passage, actually, quite often cited by commentators.
Yeah.
Okay, so it goes, and again, this is the translation. When the stables burnt, the master returned from court asking, "Was anyone hurt?" He did not ask about the horses.
Yeah. Right. The incident is that his stables are burning. Confucius, the commentators explain, was at court. He had some business there, and he finds out about the stables burning, rushes home, and the first thing he asks about was any person hurt, essentially. He didn't ask about the horses. Yeah. So you might think, well, that's not very surprising. Surely he wants to know if people are hurt. But actually, I think it's recorded because it is a bit surprising. Servants, stable hands, you can lose one and then go hire another at very small or trivial cost. Horses are very valuable things. So there's this beautiful humanity. It's just very humane of Confucius to instinctively ask about people who might have been injured or killed in the fire first.
Even in the earliest versions of this passage, you get very different readings of it. And one is simply saying that the right ritual thing to do is to ask about people, and implying that the horses are an economic cost in a way that you don't trouble yourself with, along the lines of some of the other passages that we've been talking about of that nature. The Li Ji, for example, Kongzi leaves court to talk to people who are displaced by the fire and bows to them as befits their status. Another Han text called the Kongzi Jiayu, or the family sayings of Confucius, explains that when he was serving in office, this happened. And when Zigong asks him why, when his disciple asks him why, Kongzi says this is an example of the way of mutual condolence. Or as Liao and Li say in their new translation of this text, they read it as thanking the firefighters out of gratitude for services rendered. So in those cases, it matches what we were talking about with being concerned with maintaining the proper ritual, even in an emergency situation.
Mm-hmm.
not starting to worry about losing the economic investment in the horses.
Yeah. Right. So it's a demonstration of how he tracks the ritual value,
Right.
and not the so-called market value, if we can call it that, of
Right.
things. That's the most important thing for him. Yeah.
Whereas I had always read this, again, going back to the concern with the ethical status of animals we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
more in line with what the Bai Hu Tong, the discussions of the White Tiger Hall text, first century CE text. And there they make it about humans versus non-human animals. They
Mhm.
say, heaven created the myriad creatures to serve people, so a ruler's caring for his people is in conformity with heaven. I've heard of using the animals to nourish people, but I've never heard of using what is meant to nurture others to harm them. When the stables in Lu burned down, Kongzi dismissed court and asked about the people, not the horses. This shows that domestic animals are less valuable while people are more valuable. So that's a very clearly different reading of it. I'm trying to remember what the passage in the Bible, doesn't the book of Genesis talk about kind of the dominion?
Yeah, where God grants dominion to human beings over the animals and all other living creatures.
Yeah, that's Genesis. Now you are supposed to be stewards, and I think like
Oh,
there
okay.
you are supposed to take care of them, and yeah. So sometimes people think, oh, well, you just got to kind of control them at will, but the thought was you were supposed to be stewards.
Okay, that's interesting. So maybe we can bracket Genesis because maybe there's a more charitable reading of Genesis according to which you are supposed to care for animals. But just thinking in terms of like so-called ladders of life in general, these, like Aristotle's, was it a De Anima that has this? Anyway, there are passages in Aristotle. Now I'm guilty of bringing up Aristotle, where it seems like there are certain entities, gods first, then human beings, that are just more valuable. They're a higher priority
Yeah.
than other living creatures. More complex animals come next, then plant life, and so on. Okay, so we have two options, as I understand it. One is we can read it as other early texts like the Li Ji, the Record of Rites, or the Kongzi Jiayu, the sayings of the family of Confucius or the school of Confucius. Both those passages tell the same story about Confucius rushing home from court and asking about the people, not the horses. But according to those early versions, that's because that's ritually proper. You're supposed to show your gratitude and thanks to the firefighters, so to speak. Or maybe you're supposed to show your respect and concern for your employees, your stable hands. So it's still essentially about showing respect in a ritually appropriate way. That's one option. Another option is to say, oh, this is meant to demonstrate Confucius's views about the relative value of living things. Human beings are at the top of the hierarchy and animals come next. And that seems to be a way that other people read the passage. I have to say, as someone who focuses primarily on Neo-Confucian readings from the Song Dynasty and thereafter, those sorts of readings dominate. I mean, most of the commentators I looked at go to great lengths to say, although he doesn't ask about the horses, he still cares about the horses. And they explain it's just that human beings are the higher priority. There's this kind of doctrine that's sometimes translated as the doctrine of graded love or care with distinctions in Confucianism, according to which human beings are in some sense closer to us. Other human beings have a kind of stronger family resemblance to us, so we should care about them more than we do other species. And so they're quick to read it that way as illustrating something about priority of value among living creatures.
Yeah, I guess when I first read this passage, I remember I think it was Slingerland's commentary, but basically the thought was something like a lot of people at that time thought of horses in terms of monetary value. I think you pointed this out. And so he's immediately attending to the human value. I guess I do find I'm not sure if that ritual reading, it seems maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but the ritual reading or the idea that he's expressing proper ritual by not asking about the horses seems a little cold or off to me because it seems wrong to care about the ritual propriety there as the main focus rather than whether a human being was killed or hurt. It seems like the direct concern you should have if your stable burned down is whether someone died or was hurt rather than the expression of if you're. So maybe I'm misunderstanding the point there.
Yeah.
And it seems like an extraordinary passage too. And I mean, I'm imagining, maybe I have like some expensive Maserati or Ferrari in the garage, and the garage burns down, and immediately the only thing I
Yeah.
clearly directly care about is really, first of all, was anyone hurt? And despite the fact that I got these beloved expensive cars, and
Yeah.
and so that's not the first thought I have. I think for most people that wouldn't be the case, which also reveals that Confucius really had the right kind of moral attitude,
Yeah.
was concerned about the right things.
Okay,
Yeah.
Richard, I think that's a really good point. Whether the defenders of the ritual reading can respond depends upon how you understand the psychological motivation for ritual propriety. So I'd say there are like two possible ways of understanding the motivation to be ritually proper. One is that you're trying to be ritually proper under that description, right? Like the direct intentional object of your behavior is to conform to some explicit standard of ritual propriety, so that you can then apply the label to yourself or to your behavior.
Yeah.
I'm ritually proper, right?
Yeah, that seems bad.
And,
yeah.
and that seems like the wrong reaction. Yeah. If he's like, oh, well, I'm only asking about whether humans were hurt or not because I want to be ritually proper, that's problematic. But there's this other view that certainly appears a lot in the Confucian tradition, according to which the ideal is to be ritually proper without directly aspiring to be ritually proper under that description, right? Where it's like a natural byproduct of your behavior, in the same way that you might be filial without striving to be filial as a direct object of your motivation, right? Like one of your parents is in the hospital and you want to visit her just because you care about her and you want to comfort her, not because you're trying to be a filial child or you're trying to get the label applied to your behavior or something.
Yeah. Well, by being concerned and visiting your sick mother, yeah, you are exemplifying filiality, but being filial shouldn't be the direct goal of what you're doing. Yeah. That seems not right.
Yeah, but I have to say I'm a little torn. I mean, I want to read the passage as essentially establishing that he cares about human beings more than he cares about horses. And as a vegetarian and someone who cares about animal welfare, I want him to still care about horses a little bit too,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
just not quite as high a priority. But on the other hand, the passage does appear in Book 10, which is otherwise about ritual propriety. And as Mark points out, there are these other early texts that tell the same story, primarily to illustrate his ritually proper response to the burning of the barn. Well, I suppose we've talked about all three of these passages in great depth, so we should probably pull it together and sum up a little bit. We have a couple of questions from Mark. One of them is, having read your excellent book on Confucius, essentially from the point of view of the authors of this Han Dynasty biography, and then later iterations of Confucius as extra layers, I wonder how much do the passages that we read today really cohere with the Han Dynasty account of Confucius that you found there?
I think chapter 10 doesn't tell you at all whether this was learned and cultivated or whether he was born that way. So to some extent, it doesn't bear on that. But as I mentioned at the outset, the book takes each stage in Kung's life. It starts out with this tomb biography description of that stage of his life, and then kind of surveys other ways that that phase of his life is described at other times and in other sources. And compared to many early accounts, actually, the tomb biography, the Hai Ho biography, doesn't pay very much attention to ritual. It has that one mention at the beginning, but, other Han sources, for example, say that when he was 17, he got his first job because he became known for his understanding of ritual. That's omitted in the Hai Ho biography. But what's emphasized is this Han Dynasty political kind of almost Confucius's world historical status, I guess you might, call it. And so I think that's really interesting in the sense that the Analects has a whole chapter devoted to this, but the biographical telling, the one that's more aligned with a set of historicist concerns or political concerns, isn't dealing with the ritual rules or his ability to always act in the ritually correct way. And so To that extent, reading chapter 10 really cements this idea that there are already multiple accounts of Confucius as early as
Mm.
the Han Dynasty, when probably the Analects was codified in the way it is, and this mirror stand biography was written.
Yeah. So he was a legendary figure. So, of course, stories accrued to him, right? That
Mhm.
people would tell stories about him, and they're all meant to illustrate how he's remarkable in one way or another. Don't worry so much about how consistent those stories are, but let's gather them all together and put them in a biography. Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of this account of Confucius as this almost preordained world historical figure, there's another bit in the biography that I didn't read, according to which he reached adulthood. I can't remember what the age was. And he was already really tall. And so people referred to him as a tall guy. That also is meant to say something about how he had heaven's backing or how he was endowed by nature for greatness.
So, on that view that he was preordained by heaven or Tian, is the idea then that to be compatible with that view, that Tian never did have in mind Confucius as becoming a king or having a high level of authority? Would that be the story you would tell on that picture? So he was ordained by heaven, and then how come he never got to a high level position? Well, that wasn't what heaven had in mind. That wasn't the goal or the end.
Yeah, my answer would be that there are multiple stories going around. And
Hmm.
one is that his qualities, as it turns out, that the Han biography would say, it turns out his qualities were that of someone who could write a book like the Spring and Autumn Annals that would encode his understanding of the way to construct a successful society for future generations, right? So that was
Mhm.
actually what he was being selected for by heaven. But the other story that you find in a lot of texts is that there's a kind of alternation, and that certain people are recognized as sage kings if you're born every 500 years, say. There's a moment when a sage king is needed, and then
Mhm.
that person is elevated. But if you're born at a time when things are going kind of okay, kind of badly, kind of,
Mhm.
then heaven's not going to see a need to raise anyone. And so I think of them as different notions of contingency that are kind of coexisting. And I feel like even in this early biography that I'm writing about, you have different elements of the biography that come out of these somewhat different notions of contingency.
Yeah. I like the turn of phrase that you use in the book, Mark, to describe this account of Confucius, which itself has multiple layers. The account is Confucius as uncrowned king, right? So he has all the qualities of a king, but he never gets the crown. He never actually gets the political position. And so then, as I understand it, you're saying there are at least two different ways of accounting for the fact that he never gets the crown. One is that, well, actually, what he was meant to do was not rule in person, but be this kind of intellectual, spiritual forerunner to future sage rulers by rediscovering and then encoding, as you say, the regulations and policies and rituals of the sage kings of old in this text, the Chunqiu, the Spring and Autumn Annals, so that other people would read it and then they themselves could rule by using these enlightened policies. So that's one account, is that he's this intellectual, spiritual forerunner to the good kings. But the other one is that actually the time wasn't right for him. He had all the qualities of the king, but heaven only raises those people up to political positions at certain times in the cycle, and it just wasn't the right time. So he was fated both to have the qualities of a king, but also not to be a king, maybe.
Yeah, exactly right. I think the latter one you'll find in the Mengzi, right? The 500-year
Yeah.
cycle of the sage, right? The former one is the one this biography embodies. And in a way, that one is more suited to the imperial period when this was created, because by that time, the
Mm.
Han ruling house was hereditary. And so,
Mm.
the idea that a sage comes and could be recognized by heaven and raised up to be a ruler is kind of incompatible with their kind of hereditary autocracy that they've got. So
Yeah.
there on the mirror stand that the emperor has is a picture of Confucius and a narrative where he was a guy who wrote a book that if you have access to, you are a good ruler. And in a way, it fits much better for the Liu family that ruled China during the Han to have a Confucius of that kind, right?
Yeah.
Who produced this book that their ministers had access to and helped them read and interpret, then in a way made them sage kings, right?
Yes.
Uh,
Right.
and there was no danger of someone coming along and being a sage that then would replace the Liu clan and get heaven's mandate in that way.
That was all really fascinating. Yeah, and then I was going to ask Mark what he's up to now. Now that he finished the book, you're going to Hawaii, or you're going to take a long break, or are you on another project immediately?
I'm not being paid to say I'm going to Disneyland, but yeah, I'm working on a book now that had its origins in teaching. I teach at Berkeley, and I often have this challenge when I'm talking about the early period that people, and this isn't just among students, I think it's in a lot of the materials that they're exposed to, that they will talk about Confucianism and Taoism existing at a very early stage. There's this ideal of Taoism that people will say, oh, well, even before the imperial period, there was a current of Taoist thought. Since I'm responsible for teaching these courses, I've always wanted there to be a kind of explanation for where those terms come from, those isms come from. And so I'm doing a book on the second century BCE that traces the idea of the word Tao, or kind of what the word Tao connotes and its conceptual history of it during that century, because that's a time when if you go from, say, the beginning of the second century all the way to the end with the writing of the Shiji and the construction of categories of Confucianism and Taoism in the Shiji and the records of the historian, you can see unfolding where these terms came from and what they meant in the early period. And it would be a chance for me to give my students something to read that will say, well, there weren't Confucianism and Taoism per se at the early period, but this is what they grew out of and why those terms started being used.
Yeah, that is fascinating. If I could just add a little bit to explain to the listeners who aren't so steeped in sinology. So there's this view that's relatively well accepted among scholars, maybe not all scholars, but a lot of scholars that I know, that actually not all the schools were well defined and self-consciously schools in preaching classical China. In fact, this idea that there were well-defined schools is an artifact maybe of the first great historian to characterize intellectual movements at the time, who came along much later, and that's Sima Qian, who wrote the Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, and he characterizes Chinese thought as consisting of these various schools. One name he gives to both Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi is Taoist, or Daojia. And that's actually, in terms of the kind of historical archaeological record, a bit anachronistic. That is, there isn't a lot of evidence that the various authors of the various parts of the Zhuangzi self-identified as belonging to a Taoist school. And so people who are mindful of this, like you, are always interested in looking for the origins of what eventually was a relatively well-defined kind of intellectual religious tradition, Taoism. And one of the distinctive features of Taoism as we know it today is that there's this belief in Tao not just as a way of life or a social order, a kind of normative ideal or something, but instead as a cosmic source or as a cosmic entity. That seems to be one of the, what we now think of as one of the distinguishing features of Taoism, is that they not only posit that it exists, but that it's very important. It's like a foundation or a source for living and social order. And so you're wondering, where does that come from? Is that right?
Yeah, although I think when Sima Qian uses it, the first time he talks about Daojia or Taoism,
Yeah.
It's more like the idea that ways, that there are these different Taos that are efficacious. And so it's less the Tao of the Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching, the cosmic substrate of the universe, or whatever you want to say. Tao is in a kind of more metaphysical sense, but it's more the idea that there are these Taos that people have that are effective in different areas, especially in terms of governing. And so I think it's kind of interesting that when we think of Taoism, we tend to think of the Tao Te Ching, we tend to think of Lao Tzu type Tao, but I'm not sure that that's what it meant at the earliest times.
Yeah, right. Yeah, this historian actually, I think his classification of the schools of thought, including Daojia, including Taoism, is more motivated by competing views about governance and social order.
Yes.
And so he wouldn't be very interested in specifying what any given school's view about Tao as a cosmic entity is. Well, it's been a delight. Mark, thanks so much for joining us for this wide-ranging discussion. It's really great to have your expertise and also connect with you again.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I mean, one thing I really like about your podcast is the way that you make sure that people don't talk as if they were talking to their graduate students. And since I spent a lot of time talking to my graduate students, this is a really great exercise for me to actually, define my terms and make sure that I'm not banking on people already knowing what the Bai Hu Tong is. So I think you guys are great at this. So
thanks.
I appreciate the opportunity.
That's wonderful to hear. Yeah, that's high praise as far as I'm concerned. We do hear a lot from people who are not academics. They don't make a living on teaching or researching Chinese thought. It's been really gratifying for us that we've managed to attract such a large audience. Okay, well, we'll call it a wrap and say that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.